Well, hi y'all, it's CG Funk, and this is Outside the Room. Now you might recall that we had an episode in December and we gave you a little introduction to cranial sacral therapy. Well, I wanted to just share a little more information about cranial sacral work, and today I'm going to talk to you about the cranial rhythm and also another technique called the temporal ear pull. So let's start with the cranial rhythm first. Now, earlier in December, we learned that the techniques for cranial sacral therapy work to relieve compression and restriction in the bones of the head, the spinal column, and the sacrum. And we also learned that these compressions or restrictions happen when we're injured, when we're stressed. Everything in life is coming at us and it just compresses the body. And the cranial techniques are designed to help alleviate that compression and give us more space in those areas of the head, spinal column, sacrum. So when a cranial sacral therapist addresses the head or the spinal column, sacrum, but we're going to address the head today, they look for these restrictions and compression by palpating what is known as the cranial rhythm. Now, the cranial rhythm is this very slight inhale and exhale movement that happens in these bones. And the only way that you really can feel it is by sitting very still and quiet and gently holding areas of the head like this. I have the sides of the head. And you just sink into yourself and you start to perceive that these little bones have this kind of expansion, contraction movement. And where they're not expanding and contracting evenly on both sides, or perhaps not expanding and contracting at all, we can assume that there's probably some type of compression within the areas of these sutures of these bones, or if we're palpating the spinal column, the same thing. Now, the cranial rhythm and what creates it is really a mystery. There are a handful of theories out there that tell us different ways that the body could create this movement of expansion and contraction, very, very slight. Some think that the brain has some type of contractile capacity, so it's actually the brain inside the casing of the skull that is expanding, pushing the bones out. Some people think that it's the cerebral spinal fluid, another theory. So this cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid that moves around the brain and into the spinal column and then comes back up. It basically keeps these areas moist and healthy. This cerebral spinal fluid, it goes down the spine and back up the spine and cycles all the way through the brain and the spine in about a 7-hour period. So some believe, and one of the theories is that the movement of this cerebral spinal fluid is what creates that expansion and contraction movement. And the last theory is that I'm going to share with you today is that it's energetic, that this movement is caused somehow by the energy systems in our body, either by the chakras or by the meridians. And so this whole movement is a mystery to them. But whatever theory you buy into, and I'm not going to tell you which one I do because it's a personal choice and belief, but whatever theory that you buy into, you're still going to be able to practice and palpate this rhythm and be able to determine where the restrictions are in the areas that you're palpating. And again, I'll demo it for you really quick, and then we're going to bring a model in to show you more. But you have your hands with about 5 grams of pressure on the sides of the head. You get very quiet and very in yourself. I always like to close my eyes when I do this because I'm sinking into this space of out of the chatter in the brain and into the sensation of my hands and what they're feeling. And then very gently, and sometimes this could take 2, 3, 5 minutes before you feel any type of movement. And just know that even this cradling of the head for the client that you're working on is very soothing, it's very relaxing, and it helps them relax as well. Well, hello. So I just want to show you how to palpate the rhythm, and I want to just kind of talk through Christy's neck here a little bit. From what I'm looking at, I'm looking straight down her body, and her neck sits skewed off a little to the left, and her head is kind of higher on the left than it is on the right. So if I put her back to just being in alignment with her spine, Christy, that's how it would feel. Like, how does that feel? Does it feel funny?
Yes.
Yeah, because she's used to having it be off or askew. So that one of our goals of cranial sacral therapy is to help realign that, because that should be just a nice, beautiful flow of a straight line from the head. The chin should be in the center here, and then everything should just be straight down the body. So what I like to do is I take the ear right here and I put it between my ring finger and my middle finger, so that I've got a very good cupping, and I'm covering a lot of this area. Right now I'm touching the mandibular, I'm touching the temporal bones, I'm touching the parietal bones, and I've also got my index finger on the sphenoid here. So that's like, you want to have that good coverage on there so that you can feel how these bones are starting to move. And I'm going to do it on the other side too. And of course, watching someone do cranial work is kind of like watching paint dry or grass grow, because there's not much action to it. All the action is internally in my hands and what I'm feeling. I did palpate Christy's head before we started this segment, and I can tell you what I found. So what I found is her cranial rhythm is really interesting, because it's expanding on one side and then the other side, as opposed to moving beautifully together like this. Now she has good expansion. There's a lot of good expansion coming out on the right side, but the left side is not as good expansion. In fact, you can tell there's restrictions there by the lack of expansion or the lack of movement out. So instead of doing this beautiful out and in movement, she's doing this. And this is all the body's way of compensating if we have injuries or restrictions in certain areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hold this. I'm going to show you how you hold this. And you want to get your body straight, and you want to get quiet, and you want to close your eyes. And then you want to see what you sense in the movement or lack of movement in those bones. And again, like I told you when I was doing the explanation on the cranial rhythm, this can be very calming and soothing for your guest. I always make sure to tell them what I'm doing, though, before I start doing it, so they just don't think I'm just sitting here holding their head. There is a purpose to this. For you to become experts at sensing this rhythm, this beautiful rhythm, oceanic rhythm, I like to call it, the waves coming in, the waves going out. You have to practice. It's like anything, learning an instrument, learning to ski, learning to bake. So I recommend, if you're interested in this work, that you take time every day to hold someone's head, whether it's a family member or someone in your practice. And start training your fingers and hands to feel that very, very slight movement. And remember, you don't want to have this a heavy hold. I'm not smashing anything in. I'm just gently cupping about 5 grams of pressure. How does that feel, Christy?
Quiet.
She said it feels amazing and quiet. And I'm still sensing that same pattern of expansion on one side and then expansion on the other, but not coming out together. So we're going to do a technique in a little bit. I'm going to show you a technique that's going to help with that. So that was how to palpate the cranial rhythm. And remember that you need to practice this. A lot of times it takes a lot of practice before your hands really start sensing this very, very slight movement. But once you do, you'll have it. It's like riding a bicycle. You'll always be able to find that cranial rhythm, and you'll always be able to help your clients by finding the rhythm, finding where it's restricted, and releasing those restrictions through various techniques that are known as cranial sacral therapy. So the next thing I want to show you is I want to show you the temporal ear pull. Now, as you recall, in the December session, I shared the technique, the occipital base release. And I love that technique. And I don't just use it when I'm doing cranial sacral therapy. I use it I put it in even in a regular massage, especially when people have a lot of restrictions and pain and a lack of flexibility in their necks. It's a beautiful technique for many, many reasons. But today I want to talk about temporal ear pull. And basically what this is going to address is this bone here that I'm pointing to. It's the temporal bone. And you've got one on each side. And what we're going to be doing with the technique is we're going to be using the ears as the pull to pull that bone out. Now the temporal bone connects to the mandible. You see how this is connected? So a lot of times if there's restrictions in the temporal mandibular joint, or if they call it joint dysfunction basically, you can address that by relieving the restrictions and compressions on the temporal bone. This technique is also good for relieving a restriction in the suture that connects the temporal bone to the sphenoid. And remember that sphenoid is in the center of the head here. I'm pointing to it. It's this little orange area here. And the sphenoid is like the balance or the scales of our head. So by doing the temporal ear pull, it can help with that. It can also help with the zygomatic bones, which can cause sinus issues if they're compressed. Well, we've got the model back on the table here, and I'm going to be showing you a technique called the temporal ear pull that I discussed with you earlier. Now remember, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the ear, the lobe of the ear, to gently pull this bone out and down away from the parietal bones, the frontal bone, the zygomatic bones, and the mandible, okay? So how we do this is we don't just pull straight out, because if we pull straight out, that bone is still going to be jammed in here, if you can see that. So the temporal ear pull is about gently pulling out and down at the same time, kind of like a 90-degree angle from the table. And I'm going to move Dana the skull so you're able to see this. So I'm going to be having my index finger behind her ear and my thumb just inside like this. I'm using this fleshy part of the ear. And then I'm going to be pulling. Now I'm going to over-exaggerate this so you can see the direction. But when I actually do the technique, you're not pulling this hard. So I'm going to be pulling out and down at the same time. Again, so that ear is like a 90-degree angle from the table. This is going to help release that bone from these parietals, the frontal, the sphenoid, the mandible, and the zygomatic bones. So what that's going to do is it can address inner ear problems, it can address headaches, it can address temporal mandibular joint dysfunction, and it also can help clear these sinuses. So what we're going to do, again, index finger behind, thumb in, on both sides at the same time. I'm pulling out and down, and then we're going to hold. Remember that cranial work is all about getting in the position, pulling or pushing the techniques, and holding for an extended period of time. As we talked about in December, it's kind of like the analogy of helping a boat to move in the water. You don't just push it once and it moves. You kind of have to lean on it and then it'll move through the water. Cranial is really like that. You're pulling gently the area that you're working on and then you're holding it for an extended period of time. Now, some of the things that you might sense as you hold this, and I would say 5 minutes at a minimum for each technique. You might feel those bones starting to give and move a little more. You might feel more movement. The client might go into kind of a relaxed state. Not with me talking, of course. Christy's not going to go into a relaxed state, but really, this is a wonderful technique for ear problems, headaches, issues and problems in the mandibular joint there. I'm pulling down and I'm pulling out. So what I'm feeling right now is I can feel that her fascia is starting to give a little bit on that left side. I'm starting to get a little bit more expansion movement over there. But I also know that from palpating her earlier that a part of her issue is in the mandibular joint and in the sphenoid and probably a bit in the frontal bone. So we'd have to do a whole session on her to actually help relieve some of that compression. That was the temporal ear pull. Remember, gently, 5 grams of pressure or so, pulling out and down at the same time. You know, honestly, you guys, there is so much amazing, energetic magic to the cranial sacral therapy. And of course, I'm only just scratching the surface here on what I'm teaching you. If you're interested in learning more, I would seek out teachers in your area, or maybe teachers that are teaching at a conference or that you'd have to travel to. There are some wonderful, great institutes out there that teach cranial sacral therapy, and they have levels from beginner to advanced to expert. So if you are interested in this work, you can use the techniques that I've showed you so far, which is the occipital base release, the temporal ear pull, and of course, the most important technique before you get started is palpating the cranial rhythm. If you just practice those 3 over the course of weeks, like maybe every day, grab your partner, grab your child, grab a friend, and practice those techniques, you will start being able to interpret what the movement or lack of movement of those bones mean. You'll be able to sink in and feel that cranial, that beautiful cranial rhythm and that movement, and be able to assess where there's restrictions and compressions. And you know what? It just might light a spark in you and say, that's what I want to learn. I want to learn more about this work. I want to go deeper in this work. And I really want to use cranial sacral therapy to help ease the dysfunction and pain and stress and anxiety of my clients, and also to help reset so that they can physically move better and that they feel better every morning when they wake up. So try those techniques again: occipital base release, temporal ear pull, and of course start with palpating the rhythm, and you'll be surprised at what you can feel and sense just by practicing those for a few months. I hope you enjoyed this segment of Cranial Sacral Therapy and of Outside the Room. I sure enjoyed spending time with you. I want to thank our beautiful model, Christy, and of course our skull, Dana, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. From my heart to your heart, namaste.